Hello, my name is Jakob Skovgaard. I'm from Lund University in Sweden, and I'm here to guide you through a brief summary of my recent article with Review of International Studies called Economisation as Boundary Work, Integrating Climate Change into IMF Surveillance. So the IMF is a very powerful economic institution. It's difficult to imagine a transition to a net zero world in which the IMF does not integrate climate change into its operations, but still around. This is because the IMF is a very powerful institution. It stands out among international organizations due to its possibility for influencing financial markets. For instance, its surveillance reports may influence how much of interest rate a country pays on its government debt. Yet, the integration of climate change has been hotly considered within the IMF Executive Board. It's worth mentioning that the IMF sort of consists of two parts. The Executive Board, where you have all representatives of the member states, you have 24 of them representing mainly the largest economies, and then you have the IMF staff on the side. And whereas the Executive Board is the institution that decides on IMF policy. Generally speaking, the IMF staff is a bureaucracy that prepares but also carries out the decisions of the IMF Executive Board. And on the background of this contestation, it is rather striking that the Executive Board in 2021 decided to integrate assessments for each state, each member state, of one, the economic risk that climate change could pose to the state, and two, the risk that the state poses to climate change, for instance, due to its emissions. In the article, I make the case that this integration of climate change into IMF surveillance can be seen as a case of boundary work. And this boundary work takes place via the mechanism of economisation. In other words, defining a hitherto non-economic issue as being economic and then bring it into the area of operations of an economic institution, in this case IMF. And specifically in this case, it was about defining climate change as being macro-critical, something that could pose a risk to macroeconomic stability and growth, which are the core objectives of the IMF according to its mandate. And hence, this definition defined climate change as a legitimate target for IMF intervention. This has been, as I said, controversial. Since the 90s, there's been debates with the IMF how and to which degree should address climate change. And there's been a recurring argument that this was better left to other institutions, such as the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change or the World Bank. They had more expertise when it comes to environmental issues. And although within the last 10 to 15 years there has been increasing attention to climate change within IMF, especially to fossil fuel subsidies, it hasn't really been part of its core activities such as surveillance or lending. But with the 21 decision, it was decided to integrate three kinds of risk into IMF surveillance. And this is surveillance that the IMF staff undertakes of each and every country's economies and the various risks to the economy. And the three types of risk were, first, the physical risk, the impact of climate change. Secondly, transition risks, the risk that fossil fuel assets and investments within this country would become stranded and hence posing a risk to its economy. And thirdly, and more controversially, mitigation risk, the risk that each state's emissions pose to the global economy because it drives climate change. And this was suggested by the IMF staff. This should only be included in the surveillance for the 20 largest emitters. If we look into how this happened, how this came about, there's little doubt that the IMF staff had an important entrepreneurial role, especially when it came to the idea of addressing mitigation and not just physical and transition risks. But this role was confined by the scope conditions of member state preferences in the Executive Board and the IMF mandate. If you look at the member states, there are some member states were very much in favor of expanding the IMF's operations into climate change. They were France, the UK, vulnerable developing countries, Canada and the US under the Biden administration. But there was also another group of countries which were more skeptical of this. These included emerging economies such as China, India, Saudi Arabia, but also some industrialized and some African countries. And they argue that it was beyond the IMF mandate and it was problematic that the IMF would branch out into assessing climate mitigation policies of countries because it would be beyond the mandate and because it didn't have the expertise to do that. And this opposition meant there was some kind of softening of the provisions regarding mitigation risk, and the IMF staff could not, to the same degree as initially proposed, monitor and assess each state's or each of the 20 largest emitters' mitigation policies. But this was just a brief summary of my article. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you will check it out on Review of International Studies homepage. And all that is left now is to say thank you for listening to this video and watching it to the very end. Thank you.